welcome. Gabby here. This is the Happier Life Project, brought to you by mental health and wellness app My Possible Self in partnership with the Priory Healthcare. Now, when it comes to my personal journey towards building a happier life, yoga has completely changed it. In fact, as I record this introduction to the pod 2 days ago, I returned from Portugal where I completed my 200-hour yoga teacher training. So going back to the title and theme of this episode, the incredible benefits of yoga, I could quite easily sit here for the next 45 minutes and record solo an episode just talking about my own transformational journey with the practice and how it continues to support me. However, I'm not going to do that. I'm not the only one whose life has been transformed for the better, happier, and way healthier when it comes to yoga. Yoga and mindfulness teacher James Rafael, who has 800 hours of training under his belt and over 15 years of teaching experience, has made it his mission to share the healing practices of yoga, mindfulness, and qigong to uplift, energize, and enrich his students' lives. I'm a big fan of James's teaching style, as you're about to hear, and so I asked him to record an episode with me to give you, and we're really just scratching the surface here, the foundations into why and how yoga is such a magical practice that will benefit our physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. So, ready to find a healthier, happier you? Let's get started. Welcome, James Rafael, to the Happier Life Project. You're a yoga, mindfulness and qigong teacher and also a writer, I believe.
Correct. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I will fangirl first of all and tell you how I found you, which was, ironically, it was on a yoga retreat. I broke my wrist in multiple places, not doing the yoga, but on a quad bike. So I was desperate to keep up my practice because I do love yoga, and I found your wrist-free classes on YouTube. And I really, really enjoyed them. And also, I still got a really, really good workout because I thought, oh, no, I'm not going to be able to do a lot of the positions and stuff. But yeah, you proved me wrong in a good way there.
Yeah, the risk-free thing it was totally kind of a happy accident, really, I guess. During the period of that kind of first lockdown, I think lots of people suddenly were climbing the walls and trying to, do more physical stuff, monitor their health. So everyone was doing all these body weight programs and loads of yoga. And I think just a ton of people ended up with wrist injuries or wrist strain. So I developed a few videos for students of mine that had happened to, because they were doing a lot more than they used to. And it just kind of went from there. And I realized there was a lot of people who needed it. So glad you found it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're going to dive into yoga today. Let's start with, yes, yoga is great for physical health, but the real magic happens when we practice it for our mental, emotional, and even spiritual health. Would you agree?
Completely agree. And I think there's an interesting piece to say here first and foremost, which is that when we think about yoga in kind of a contemporary sense, especially in the West or global North, however we determine what that is, we think of it purely as this physical practice. And really, the yoga poses in the physical practice is just one very small component of the wider philosophical and spiritual traditions. So there's a piece to be said about honoring the history, the cultural traditions and the philosophical traditions of yoga in a way where, we decolonize our practice. This is a hot topic, right? Decolonizing our yoga practice. So as well as this whole piece around honoring the traditions of yoga, kind of from a respectful cultural context, I think we're also just missing out if we view it purely as a physical practice, because there are so many other benefits and beautiful ways we can work with the traditions of yoga for mental, spiritual, and physical health. And I think if we view it purely as this physical thing, we're shortchanging ourselves and we miss out on a huge amount of richness.
That's why I actually didn't pick back up with yoga for years, because I went to my local gym and thought, oh, I'll give it a go. I mean, this is going way, way back. And I just couldn't connect with it. I was bored. I certainly couldn't quieten the mind. I was thinking about all sorts of other things. And then it was during the pandemic where I was really stressed, working crazy hours for a huge corporation. It was eat, sleep, work, repeat. Couldn't really do much because we were all in lockdown, right? And then I thought, I'm going to give yoga another go. But this time round, I found two amazing teachers online. They had devoted their life to teaching yoga and meditation versus a gym instructor that had probably done the shortest course they could to get the certificate. And also it was my personal approach to yoga as well that changed. Whereas during the pandemic, I wasn't going into it for the yoga bod. I was going into it for my mental health and, you know, to help me with stress. And then it worked and I became addicted. So
right.
There we go.
And I think,
but it's not about me, it's about you. So I'd love to know your story.
okay, cool. So I can share my story, but just kind of echoing what you were saying. I think, you know, I encountered a lot of people, a lot of new students, a lot of new, you know, practitioners during that first and second lockdown. I think for the reasons that you're, you know, articulating, Gabby, that actually people suddenly realized, well, what can I do for my mental health as well as my physical health? And then people start thinking about meditation, and then maybe there's more curiosity within yoga and what yoga can offer for the mind and for the heart. So I definitely saw an uptake and a more, I think, a more open-mindedness and a greater receptivity, I think. Partly because people were a bit desperate, right? Just like desperate.
I know I was.
Help, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
so let's get into your story because it's a really interesting one. You're a very smart Cambridge graduate, and then I believe, doing a bit of snooping online, that you worked in like branding and marketing first.
Correct. So I, you know, fresh out of uni, Cambridge was a great experience, kind of typical student life in some ways, you know, working super hard, but also partying a lot, typical kind of British student drinking an insane amount. And, you know, at the time it was just kind of fun and it was what I was doing. But I think up until that point, sort of my existence had been very much in this kind of bubble of academia and work. And then I moved to London when I graduated and moved into my first job. And it was a real, you know, shock to my system. I found it super hard to make that adjustment. I'd had kind of a history already of some kind of mental health challenges. So as a teenager, obsessive compulsive disorder and physical self-harm, as well as, you know, fluctuating bouts of depression and anxiety and panic attacks. And so that was something that was already kind of part of the way that I was. And then coming into the working world for the first time, I think just kind of supercharged all of that, really. And so very rapidly, you know, I moved into my first corporate job, which was in marketing and branding. There were great things about that, but my sort of flirtation with burnout was kind of continual and always dipping into these periods of intense anxiety, stress, and panic. And like many people, my way of dealing with that was I just go out all weekend and just let loose and blow off steam and party like crazy. And that kind of gathered a bit too much momentum, right? And I ended up using a lot of drugs and ended up winding up with different types of substance addiction throughout that process as a way of kind of coping. And so I actually came to meditation, mindfulness-based meditation first. And that occurred because, like many people, you don't realize you have a problem first. It's usually your friends that realize you have a problem.
Yeah. Or you have loved ones, yeah.
Had a few good meaning friends who picked me up and said, I think you need to sort yourself out, mate. And so I started going to like not a drug rehabilitation service, but kind of a drug management service in Soho, where I was living at the time in London. And really just to kind of moderate my using and try to get some control over it. It was about harm reduction, which was what I really needed at the time because stopping wasn't something I was interested in. And one of the kind of peripheral supports that they offered at this service was they recommended meditation. And they recommended this really wonderful little place in Covent Garden called, I think it's called Inner Space, run by these wonderful Indian ladies. And it's a little tiny bookshop with a meditation room downstairs. And so I started going there and meditating in that practice. And it gave me some hint that there was a light somewhere at the end of the tunnel. And so I persisted. And then I started doing silent retreats, which, many of your listeners may have heard of before.
Wow.
These 10-day silent retreats, which were intense, quite full on, but kept giving me these kind of tastes of a greater sense of peace and freedom that I could create for myself potentially, that I had the power to elicit that within myself if I could kind of focus on it. And so as a kind of adjunct to all of this, I was then doing yoga at my local gym. And I started to kind of put the two things together, that the space of yoga, of movement, of using my body and my breath and cultivating awareness through yoga was very similar in some ways to the meditation and the mindfulness practices. And I think I got lucky in a way that I came to meditation first, because it always allowed me to view yoga as this complete holistic system for not just physical health, but mental well-being as well.
Right.
And so for me, yoga has always been another expression of meditation.
Wow. I mean, we know it has so many incredible benefits, but I'm still also not quite sure how it happens. So I'm hoping you can help me out a bit. And obviously our listeners, we'll probably just scratch the surface today, right? Because there's so many different ways that yoga can help us. But I actually looked on, it was the Times of India, and they had let's say a top 10. I don't know if these are, I wouldn't necessarily agree these are the top 10, but I thought it was a good jumping off point to maybe give anybody listening who's thinking about yoga an incentive. So improves posture, increases flexibility, builds muscle strength, boosts metabolism, helps in lowering blood pressure, increases blood flow, keeps diseases at bay. So it's apparently got a really beneficial effect on the immune system, increases self-esteem, improves lung function, and helps you to sleep better. So those were the sort of core 10 reasons why we should do yoga according to this Times of India. What do you say about that to start?
Well, I think that all sounds great.
Yeah, it's a good jumping off point. Yeah.
Well, why don't we start practicing straight away?
Well, quite.
I agree with all those things, experientially within myself, but also within, I've been practicing and teaching within the last 15 years. And over the course of those 15 years, I would say all of those things, to my experiential knowledge, are true and are beneficial. I think probably what we can do when we look at the benefits of the physical practices of yoga first, if we look at the kind of physical and keep it kind of rooted in the body, the physical benefits, and then maybe look at...
That's where I was going with this. Yeah. Then mental, then emotional. Mm-hmm.
So I think purely from just a really practical perspective, if you imagine that you're in your working day and you get an email from a boss or a difficult client, and you read the email and there's a sinking feeling in your body, there's a tension that appears in your shoulders, maybe your jaw tightens up and you don't realize it, and your body moves into this kind of contracted shape. Often we curl up, mimicking the kind of fetal position, whether we realize it or not. Often our stress response moves the body into this kind of curled up, hunched in position. And that happens realistically multiple times a day for most of us,
Yeah,
right?
I'm sure that's resonated with a lot of people right now. Yeah.
So if you imagine throughout your day, you're kind of putting more and more tension and tightness into the body, kind of increasing a certain pattern or a certain shape. You go around like that most of the days, in fairness. And we have this illusion maybe that when we go to sleep, that magically releases from the body and everything washes away. But it's kind of been shown clinically that doesn't happen. Interestingly, as a side note, especially if you're a side sleeper, because if you're a side sleeper, you're in that same fetal position, you're in that kind of desk, hunched position. Not that side sleeping is bad, but it's just a similar pattern that we spend a lot of the day in, right? And now yoga is very interesting because the way that most forms of physical yoga are taught, there's a lot of emphasis on opening through the front of the body. So opening across the chest, lengthening and opening through the front of the hips, which are often contracted or shortened when we sit throughout the day. And there's a lot of emphasis on, stretching, moving, using active strength, and maybe using passive, relaxing stretching to help release a lot of that tension which is in the body. And okay, so that sounds like it might be a good idea, but why exactly might that be a good idea? If we're habitually constantly in this tense, stressed position, that connection between mental stress, making your body tight and feel stressed, goes both ways. So when your body is in a position that is hunched or tight or stressed, that also creates a feedback loop into your nervous system and into your brain that maybe you're not safe right now. There's many body language experts and very famous talks about this. You can find some very famous TED Talks around body language and how particular posturing can positively improve mood, self-esteem, self-confidence, and a state of being in calm control. And so just in that one way, the physical practices of yoga can help release and change those tension patterns. Now, there's other more physiological responses that occur within yoga. Your listeners may know or may have familiarity that the breath is a big part of yoga practice, right? And it's, again, been proven time and time again in many clinical studies that being able to slow down, particularly slowing down your exhale, has a positive impact on your nervous system and your sense of perceived threat. If we view stress as this kind of sense of perceived threat, that can be beneficial at times. It can push us into action. But if it's constant, it can be very overwhelming for the nervous system and for your mind. And so by regulating the breathing, we're able to help create more of a sense of calm and balance in the nervous system, which can help kind of the mental clutter or the mental chatter also settle down. And the third, I guess, and last component of this, I would say, is around attention, paying attention, awareness. I believe that all yoga practice fundamentally should be about awareness. It's paying attention to what the body is doing, what you're feeling in different parts of the body, paying attention to what your breath is doing, noticing when it's short and tight, or noticing when it's long and slow and free. And also being able to notice when you're stressed or anxious, because a lot of the time we actually don't realize how stressed or anxious we are. It's often when there's a spike, but it can be quite low level in the background all the time. And so when we practice yoga, we're really sharpening our tool or our muscle of attention, of concentration. And the more we can become aware of what's going on for ourselves, the more power we have to change that, right? This is like a fundamental tenet within talking therapies, right? We bring things to the surface, we pay attention to what's going on in our lived experience so we can look at it, observe it, and then decide what skillful action or change we might make. So I think in these different ways, yoga can be really beneficial, both to physical and mental well-being, right?
Yeah. It still really blows my mind that by putting your body in a certain position or pose, like you can do things like help your digestive system, and it's like, well, how does twisting my body in this way mean that, I'm going to be able to digest food better? But it does, right?
For sure. And I'm so glad you bring this point up, Gabby, because this is such an important and beautiful point. Often when we think of yoga in a contemporary context, we think about kind of putting your body into pretzel-like positions, gymnastics, contortion. Social media gives this false impression that that's what physical yoga is about. But actually, yoga is a healing modality. One of the main directions which yoga leads us in is towards a path of healing physical and mental well-being. And so there are many therapeutic aspects within yoga. There are poses and sequences that are softer and more gentle that can help with digestive symptoms, IBS, that kind of stuff. There's certain yoga poses which, from an anecdotal and experiential sense, really can help with migraine or headache. There's also certain yoga poses you can do that can help create a sense of balance if you are feeling really jittery or really anxious or agitated. Certain yoga poses will be better than others for certain things. And there's a whole amazing group of teachers across the globe who are working on things like the practical applications of yoga in kind of managing cancer and cancer treatment, or using yoga as a way to manage various degenerative diseases. So it doesn't have to be, doing a handstand or a cartwheel or something. Actually, so much of yoga's benefit comes in these more holistic and healing or health promoting ideas.
Well, just taking that thread and running with it, again, when I was doing a bit of research for today's episode, I didn't know this, but this was taken from a medical article. Over time, yoga's effects are also believed to slow the natural aging process. There is less brain shrinkage in the areas of the brain that process information and store memories. So making yoga a part of our lives can help protect against the effects of aging on our memory and cognition.
And I think, to my knowledge, that's true. And, like all of these things, there's studies and then there's robust peer-reviewed studies. And it's sort of difficult sometimes for the average person to parse out which study is kind of a small sample size and which study is a big sample size and with more robust data. But I believe, I can't cite them, but I believe to my knowledge, there are a couple of studies looking at grey matter in the brain and yoga or movements positive impact on maintaining grey matter in the brain. People who do lots of juggling, juggling became like a popular thing in certain movement circles the last 5 to 10 years because it has such an incredible impact on the brain, preserving memory function, your ability to kind of recall things short term and long term. And so, again, I think the key component with that is it's about awareness and coordination. It's challenging your brain, like, oh, I've got to put my hand here and I have to put my arm here. And all of that's kind of keeping the juices flowing, right? Keeping the brain alive. There's this idea that you use it or you lose it, both in muscle definition, muscle tone, but also in the way that your brain works, right? You use it or lose it. I think that's kind of a helpful way of looking at it.
Yeah, well, this came from the Harvard Health website. When you do yoga, your brain cells develop new connections and changes occur in brain structure as well as function, resulting in improved cognitive skills such as learning and memory. Yoga strengthens parts of the brain that play a key role in memory, attention, like you're saying, awareness, thought, and language. Think of it as weightlifting for the brain.
I love that analogy.
That came from the Harvard Medical website.
I love that analogy.
Okay, so let's sort of dive in a bit more into the mental health benefits. Relieving depression, reducing stress, easing anxiety, and improvement of mood are all, I think, why a lot of people do turn to yoga too, right? I mean, obviously it helped you lots. It's helped me lots as well in that respect.
And again, from an anecdotal or experiential perspective, 100%. I've probably yet to meet a person who's, practiced yoga regularly for, a month, 2 months, 3 months that hasn't found that there is some mental benefit in there. Students are always saying to me like, oh, this has really helped with X, Y, Z. And even if it's a small or subtle shift, it's still a beneficial shift that occurs for most people when they practice. I think it's about finding the right style, the right environment, and the right teacher for you. So if your listeners have tried yoga before and thought, you know what, this just doesn't click or work with me, or work for me rather, I'd say give it a second chance, maybe try a different teacher or a different style, because it's very, very varied and vast. Again, measuring things like depression and anxiety levels, they're kind of often self-reported, right? So the data in these studies is often kind of self-reported. And that doesn't mean that it's not valuable, actually, because I think if you perceive you're less depressed and less anxious, that's the main thing, right? That's the most important thing. Again, I think from my perspective, talking about myself for a moment, the process of my practice in meditation and yoga, through that quite painful period in my life where I was still going out every weekend. I was still, using substances, still very anxious throughout the week, very, very chaotic, crazy life. But I was meditating and practicing yoga within all of that. It was all kind of mixed together. And there was still a great benefit, right? There was still, I remember there were so many Friday nights when, I'd be heading on my way home from work. I'd be getting that kind of obsessive thought pattern, spiraling brain that comes with different types of addiction, obsessive compulsive behaviors. I'd be thinking, right, it's the weekend, I'm going to go crazy, I'm going to go to this. I was so dysregulated and so unsettled in myself. And there would be some weekends where I would go to a yoga class or I would meditate, and it would take the edge off and kind of either help me not go crazy or help me go slightly less crazy. And there were weeks when it just didn't work, being really honest. It doesn't every single time hit the mark. But even with all the chaos, there was this deep sense that it was giving me some benefit, and it did, it kept me alive. I'm still here, which is a testament to the practice, because, my using was quite extreme. It was life and death at quite a few junctions. I think my practice helped me survive physically. But really what happened for me was at a point 8 years ago, not only was I able to get the benefits physically and mentally of yoga and meditation, I'd also got to a point where I was strong enough to say, this, and this really aren't helping me. They're damaging me, and they're preventing me from being the best version of myself. And I was finally able to put those things down. And when I did that, the positive impact for me physically and mentally accelerated very rapidly. I'm not saying that kind of recovery from whatever it is you're recovering from is easy. It's not, it's brutal. But by having a practice, by having a consistent history of that practice, I was able to confidently move forwards and make these little adjustments and improvements in my mental health to get to a point now where I know I can handle it. And really, it's the practice that has given me that. And that's kind of my hope for anybody who comes to practice, that they stick around long enough, long term, that those benefits accumulate and there's a growing sense of self-esteem, of self-confidence, and knowing yourself well enough to make skillful decisions and when to not make certain decisions, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And then just touching as well upon like which is very interweaved with mental, the emotional effects. Like yoga can help release grief and stored trauma, can't it, as well, by, again, putting ourselves in various positions and poses, things that we've been holding on to for years. Again, we might not even know that we're holding on to it or what it is we're holding on to, but then suddenly it's boom, it's like you feel lighter.
100%. And so tell you a story. In my first ever yoga class, I sort of would go there on a weekly basis, and it was fairly strong athletic practice, and my body wasn't used to the shapes, and I would just pour and pour with sweat. It was so embarrassing. I was like a river. I used to have 2 mats. I'd use up 1 mat, I'd turn it over, and then I'd get rid of that and use the second mat. That's how much I sweated. And my teacher at the time, in a joking kind of sense, would shout across the room at me and say, "James, this isn't aqua aerobics." And, it was very, jovial and fun and welcoming the way that he would say it. But I remember in that period just thinking, like, yeah, something is being released from my body here in a big way. And then, as you said, I said this kind of tongue in cheek now, because some of my early yoga teachers, they would say to me that certain emotions are stored in different areas of the body. And so hips and pelvis, many perspectives from within certain styles of yoga would say, yeah, grief, sadness, sorrow stored in the hips. And so you get into a very deep hip stretch, a pose like pigeon pose, if any of your listeners are familiar with pigeon, pose where you're lying down, but with the leg at a right angle, and it's very deep stretch. You kind of know it, Gabby, I'm sure.
I do. It's one of my favorites.
It's great, right? And it gives you this amazing release. And I honestly, for like the first 5 or 6 months of my practice, I would just sob. I would just cry every time I got into pigeon pose. And I know this is the case for many people with certain poses. We can get these deep emotional releases that hopefully feel cathartic or healing and positive in a way. And then the other thing, which was really funny, is, my calves were very, very tight and very sore all the time. So I asked my teacher, I was like, what emotion is this? And my teacher was like, anger. Anger gets stored in the calves. And I'm still not too sure about this one. But,
wow.
After years and years of therapy, I kind of look back and I'm like, well, yeah, I have had to work with a huge amount of anger. Maybe that's what it was. I kind of have a tongue-in-cheek view on all of this. But for sure, like we said earlier, these tension patterns that get stored and held in the body, when you release them, that pathway between mind and body, if you want to look at it that way, goes both ways. So when you release tension of shoulders, it might create a feeling of mental calm and release, but it also might release some kind of emotional correlate. And so it's not uncommon for people, particularly kind of early on in their practice, to get kind of emotional releases or things coming up. And again, provided that the space is held, in a way where the intention is that it's safe, it's welcoming, that you have permission to do something or not to do something, which is so important, so important in yoga. Provided the space is held in that way, many people find these releases welcoming.
I split up with a loved one recently and I went to a yoga class, my favourite yoga class, and I sobbed at the end when we were in the final pose. It was like great and also slightly embarrassing. But it was, I guess, me releasing the grief, Actually, speaking of Shavasana, there's a magic that happens there too, right? And everybody said, well, I think a good teacher will say, don't, especially those that teach online, it's like, don't skip this one. But I find that if I've done a class, which is like a great class, that I will get tingly. It's like, I suppose it's energy that's like moving around the body, but I've never really known what's going on there. But it's just this kind of magical feeling that I've never felt in any other form of exercise.
Right. And it's great to hear you articulate that. And so Shavasana, which is, we do our practice, say it's an hour's practice, physical practice, maybe the last 10 minutes, if you're really lucky, or 5 minutes. Usually we lie down, usually on the back, arms and legs spaced out in what we call Shavasana, just this resting position. And there's different ways to consider what Shavasana is and its purpose. What I like to think of is it's backing up the hard drive or downloading. So I kind of think of, you come into Shavasana, it's very relaxing, but it's like you've just done all this movement, all this breathing, all this awareness, all this kind of what we call interoceptions, kind of feeling inwards to what's here. And that's changing something in your brain. It's changing something positive in your nervous system, in your physiology. And then you come into Shavasana and it's like, your body and your nervous system have a chance to savor, to digest, or to kind of download all that information that you've just, experienced. And so that's one way that I, to the skeptical, like to position Shavasana. It's like, backing things up. It's also, I think, this very important reminder that, yes, we can work, we can use effort, but that the importance of rest afterwards should never be disregarded, and that in order to get the full benefits of the workout or the physicality or the mental component, even resting afterwards is a very important part of being able to do the effortful bit well next time. Shavasana can be taught in a couple of different ways. I think more and more these days in kind of studios and gyms, it's kind of taught just purely as a relaxation. You clock out, you rest. If you're lucky, you drift in and out of sleep and you feel really good afterwards, right? But a little bit to your point about this tingly feeling, in some kind of traditional lineages within yoga, Shavasana, ideally, the body is totally at rest. It's like your body is asleep, or, not to be alarmist about it, but Shavasana sometimes is translated as corpse pose, because the body is as released and as still as a corpse. I prefer sleeping, but So the
Yeah.
body ideally is totally switched off. So you're not fidgeting, you're not moving. It's about stillness. In some of these traditional lineages, though, the mind is absolutely aware you're not asleep. And in the ideal state, the body is completely at rest and the mind is completely empty, no thoughts. And this is the kind of ideal. This is why sometimes people,
God, the dream. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes you have the dream, right? Catatonic. Some people would say that, Shavasana is the hardest pose of all, right? That's a common expression. It's the hardest pose of all because it's being completely still in the body, but absolutely present in your awareness without thought or fluctuation. Again, ideally. But I think what can happen, like you're describing, in a resting position after you've moved, if you are aware of what you're feeling in the body, you'll feel that things have shifted. You'll feel tingling in the hands. You'll feel that the chest feels more open. You'll feel maybe the gentle rhythm of your breath or your heart beating in a very gentle, measured way. And sometimes, these kind of sweeping sensations. My perspective is that that's always there. The body's alive with little tingles and sensations all over the place. Just most of the time, we're not present to it. And whether it's Shavasana or whether it's certain styles of meditation, when we're working with the body, more and more we come into contact with that. It's this living, breathing, shimmering. I really like this word shimmering in practice. It's kind of shimmering of different sensations. It's like a dance all throughout your being. And so if you're experiencing that in Shavasana, Gabby, great.
Yeah, it's a great sensation, but it's also like, what is this? I really liked, I saw in your Facebook, you posted recently, yoga is an act of inward listening. The more we listen, the kinder we become, and the more we can offer that kindness outwardly into the world. And I think about, kindness, compassion, and it's compassion to ourselves as well as others, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, self-care as a terminology has become very popular kind of in recent years. I think what's great in some ways about the advent of social media and different digital medias is we're more and more aware of the importance of our mental well-being and our mental health. We're more and more familiar with this idea of self-care and that it might be a good idea to be a bit more compassionate towards ourselves. And there's many wonderful resources out there that can help us find tools for that. I think yoga is one of the most profound tools that guide us towards caring for ourselves more, or if the word care is difficult for some people, being a bit more friendly with yourself, kind of making friends with yourself. And so even if we're in a group class, doing physical yoga, doing different poses, moving, breathing, being aware of different sensations in the body, that is moving us inwards. It's moving us to understand what's really going on for us, like what's really going on for you. Rather than distracting yourself and avoiding your life, it brings you back into the center of your life, which isn't always easy, right? There's stuff to deal with. But this path of yoga is, for me, a path inwards and a path of listening. What is it I really need? Do I really need to go to that high intensity, class, or actually is what I need to go and do yin yoga, which is very, still and deep and maybe more calming? Is it that I want to commit to all these things I've put in my diary this weekend? Or when I really listen inwardly through my practice, do I realize, oh, you know what? I'm exhausted. That makes it easier to offer that out to other people. I think because you're familiar with honoring your own needs, so you become more comfortable with honoring and respecting other people's needs, right? As individual people separate to yourself. But I think also by offering ourselves compassion and kindness, we can move our nervous system into a state where we're more regulated, where we feel a bit less stressed, a bit less panicked. And it's really hard to pay attention to someone else, to love them, to care for them, when we're in this state of contraction and tension and stress and just trying to survive. So if we can look after our own
Yeah.
survival, then we can turn our attention to others. And I think, you know, that process happens as a natural byproduct of yoga when it's taught and held in a, you know, a particularly compassionate way.
We've talked a lot now about the amazing, incredible benefits of yoga, but as we're drawing this conversation to a close, for the person that's new to yoga and is thinking about trying it, you mentioned yin being really good for that sort of more relaxing, stretching out your body, and it's more sort of gentler than say a vinyasa or a power. But I'd love you to kind of, if you could just sort of give a brief little synopsis of the major types.
Sure. So I'll give you kind of a bullet point list from my perspective, which might differ from other teachers, but my perspective is this. We can think about, if we're talking about the physical practices of yoga and, you know, moving in postures and being in a physical body. At the far end of the spectrum, in terms of very intense, very athletic, very physical practices, we have systems of yoga like Ashtanga Vinyasa, power yoga. These typically very athletic, very physically energizing, strong practices. Then, you know, a little bit further along that spectrum, we might have Vinyasa yoga, which, you know, is more like flowing between different poses. It can be very strong. It can also be a lot more gentle. It's kind of Vinyasa is kind of a catch-all in a way. And then moving towards maybe what we perceive as being gentler or softer forms, you might come across this word, Hatha yoga. Hatha yoga now in a contemporary context is usually not flowing between the poses. You do a pose, you hold for a few breaths, you do another pose. That's the contemporary understanding. It differs from the historic. And then there are modalities and expressions of yoga like yin yoga, which is a relatively recent kind of creation. In yin yoga, we're typically on the ground, kind of not standing, and we'll hold particular poses and stretches for longer periods of time, maybe 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 11 minutes. It's not totally relaxing because often, you know, stretching for that amount of time can be quite deep. But a lot of people find that more calming or gives them kind of emotional release. It's not athletic. Then further down the spectrum towards this end, in softer versions of yoga still, we might come into contact with what's called restorative yoga. And restorative yoga is great because we'll have lots of cushions and blankets and bolsters, and we'll lie on them in very gentle, supported positions that aren't challenging, but are deeply relaxing. And restorative yoga teaches us how to rest, how to be still, how to rest, and how to relax. And so yoga can fit anywhere on this spectrum as a physical practice. There are many, many other styles which I haven't spoken about. My best advice to someone who's new would be this. If you're completely new to yoga, I really recommend finding a beginner's course, if I'm honest. That could be online or it could be in person. Because in a beginner's course, you'll get more time to go more slowly. Hopefully it will be taught well, and you won't just learn about where you're putting your body physically, but you'll learn how we're breathing, how we're paying attention. And that will give you such an amazing foundation to build the rest of your practice on. And I see this when I get students who are new to me coming into my classes. When someone comes to me who's new to me and they've recently done a beginner's course, it's great because they're not as kind of nervous about what's going to come up. You know, I mostly teach vinyasa. They have a certain amount of confidence with certain poses, with the breathing. And I feel like they can get a lot more from it having done a beginner's course. If your listeners can't access a beginner's course, I'd recommend, you know, trying something like vinyasa, which isn't pinned as a power yoga or ashtanga or a very strong practice, just to get a feel for it. And then if you like the strength that you find there, maybe you dial it up and you try a stronger class. Or maybe you enjoy the more restorative end part of vinyasa where we cool down and we do the shavasana. And if you like that, maybe you go a little bit more towards yin and restorative. But the caveat, the last caveat that I would say on this is, consider this. Often we end up choosing a style which expresses the way that we are. So type A personality, let's say, drive, push, go. Everything's hardcore, everything's adrenaline, everything's cortisol. What kind of yoga is this person going to be drawn to? Usually power yoga. Great, no problem.
Right.
That's familiar and it's going to be amazingly helpful for them. Do it, go for it. But probably what you really need for balance is at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's going to be yin and restorative. Now, that's going to be really hard for this person because they're not used to that. But we have to look at the systems of yoga as a way of balancing the whole, bringing harmony and health and well-being into mind, body, and heart. Equally, if we're a little bit more lethargic, or we're kind of scared of pushing ourselves, or we tend to just have lots of those kind of resting practices, it could be interesting to explore strength, see what that gives you. Kind of viewing the yang to your yin, I think. But beginners classes in a beginner's course will give you such a great foundation, and I really recommend that.
Oh, that's such fabulous advice and great way, I think, to wrap up the conversation. So to find out more about you, the mothership is jamesrafael.com.
Correct.
So Rafael spelled Rafael. Excellent. So you conduct live classes a few times in the week, and you've also got loads of free videos which are on both your website and on YouTube.
Correct.
And then for anybody wanting to deepen their practice, you've got a course coming up, right? At the end of the year.
Yeah. So, I teach online live classes throughout the week, and I have those videos. But at the end of this year, starting in December, I will be teaching a yoga teacher training that's a little bit different. This teacher training teaches, people who are coming on the training, it's a year long, how to teach vinyasa yoga, but it's also very much infused with mindfulness, meditation, and also some of the Chinese practices like qigong and tai chi. So this training is called Taoist Flow, and it really incorporates what I feel are all the wonderful benefits of yoga, all the wonderful benefits of things like Tai Chi and Qigong, if you're familiar with similar practice to Tai Chi, and mindfulness-based meditation. And it's kind of a complete whole practice. And it's a very thoughtful way to practice. It's the way that I teach, really, those three modalities. So if people are interested in learning to teach or training to teach, or even just deepening their practice, that's starting off in December with a yoga studio in London called Try Yoga. And you can take the training in person in London, or you can do the whole thing online. So you can go to the tryyoga.co.uk website to find out about that.
Fabulous. So final thing, bringing our conversation full circle, I ask every guest at the end of the episode to set us some homework based on the theme of the episode. So if we are looking at yoga, what is a simple project we can do that will help us on our journey towards building a happier life? If we could take one thing away from today's conversation in terms of how would we implement something from yoga? So,
on an individual level for the listener, I would say, getting yourself to either an online class or, being mindful of kind of financial impact of that. There are so many amazing free classes on YouTube. And I would say, if you do a class or you do a little bit of yoga through an app or through a website or whatever, and it doesn't work for you, doesn't feel good, give it the benefit of the doubt. Try another style, try another teacher, because it's so incredibly varied.
Really good advice. Teacher is everything. And you are a rock star at what you do. So thank you very much, James Rafael. I really, really appreciate today and your videos. I really enjoy your style, and I think you make it less intimidating as well for people that are newer or a little bit less confident. You have a little bit of that typical British self-deprecating humour as well. If you wobble or whatever, we're all wobbling. So that empathy really comes through.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Honestly, thank you so much, Gabby.
Thank you, James, and thank you to you for making it to the end of this episode of the Happier Life Project. I'm Gabby, and at the start of the show, I mentioned that I have recently come back from my yoga teacher training in Portugal, which truly has changed my life. And next week, one of my incredible teachers, Berta Koto, who is also an Ayurveda practitioner, will be teaching us all about Ayurveda, one of the world's oldest forms of holistic medicine, which combines physical, psychological, and emotional health. Trust me, you do not want to miss that episode either. Now, if you are suffering with your mental health, there is a crisis button on the My Possible Self app, which will signpost you to the correct information for immediate expert advice. Those of you who are listening not on the app, but on one of our podcast platforms, the My Possible Self app is completely free to download, so you don't need to worry about it costing you anything. If you found this episode helpful, make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. And to find and follow us on social media, we are at My Possible Self, and I've been at Radio Gabby. So please do take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.